ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
The Israeli leader is under increasing pressure to negotiate a ceasefire in the war in Gaza, as families of the hostages taken by Hamas on October 7 plead for more to be done to bring them home. So why is Benjamin Netanyahu not willing to give any ground? And can he survive growing anger and protests? Today, Dr. Eyal Mayroz, an expert on peace and conflict studies at Sydney Uni, on the fate of more than 100 hostages still unaccounted for. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Eyal, on the weekend, tens of thousands of people took to the streets in Israel. The outrage, I think it's fair to say, was palpable, wasn't it?
Yes, I think it was even more than tens of thousands. They're talking about hundreds of thousands, which was certainly unprecedented since the beginning of the war. Certainly potentially a new phase in the struggle for ending the war in Gaza.
Frustration and fury explodes onto the streets of Tel Aviv.
Police have again clashed with Israeli protesters who shut down roads in anti-government demonstrations across the country.
A massive strike by hundreds of thousands of workers is also expected as Israelis vent their anger with their own government.
There have been, of course, these sorts of protests before, but not at this scale, right? This was a real moment, and it came, of course, after the Israeli military said it had recovered the bodies of 6 hostages killed in Gaza.
Yes, I think what had happened after the finding of 6 hostages that were shot by Hamas, the long-time, sense of hopelessness on the part of many in the Israeli public who wanted the war to end but didn't think it was getting anywhere, was replaced with outrage because the large majority of the Israeli public believes that Netanyahu is putting obstacles in the way of concessions towards a ceasefire. So this outrage, I think, was replacing the hopelessness and led to this outpour of, both mentally but also of a lot more people into the streets.
Yeah, and devastatingly, Hamas has now released video messages from some of the hostages filmed before they were executed. It's just horrifying. Of course, it's been absolutely devastating for the families of those executed. Rachel Goldberg-Pollen, the mother of Hirsch, who was one of the 6 found dead, spoke at his funeral.
Finally, my sweet boy, finally you're free. I will love you and I will miss you every single day for the rest of my life.
That family had campaigned heavily for more to be done to get the hostages home.
Hirsch's family and parents were able, being Americans, but also very articulated, they were able to bring his story and the story of the other hostages to international audiences.
Rachel Goldberg, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you for having me. We're running to the end of the earth. We're turning over every stone. We're throwing darts in every direction. We'll talk to anybody who could possibly be. There's no way to know who is going to be the person that can really help us.
They are now kind of in a situation where, devastated by the failure and his death, it seems like they're still, supporting the advancement of an international outcry that hopefully, especially in the case of America, that is so instrumental to any kind of move forward, might, help.
Tell me now, what has Benjamin Netanyahu had to say about these protests? What's his message to the Israeli people?
He's sending different messages behind closed doors. He's saying certain things to also to the Americans, in terms of the negotiations. But what he's saying out in the open, trying to, shore up his base, is that any kind of demonstrations against his government is actually playing into the hands of Hamas.
These murderers executed 6 of our hostages. They shot them in the back of the head. And now after this, we're asked to make concessions? What message does this send Hamas? It says, kill more hostages, murder more hostages, you'll get more concessions.
Everyone believes, and for a very good reason, that whatever Netanyahu is doing is very closely linked to his political survival. Mm-hmm. And so I think the majority of the people in Israel see that as the main cause for the failure to reach any kind of agreement. The people who are out in the streets, none of them really matters to Netanyahu in terms of political power because they will never vote for him. So more and more, increasingly so, he's taking all his decisions based on political survival and as a result, catering to his base.
So just to make that clear, the argument is that Benjamin Netanyahu is a lot more concerned about right-wing members of his cabinet, and that is really driving his decision-making when it comes to this war.
Yes, I would say that there's 2 things here. One is Netanyahu's government, as everyone knows, is the most hard-right government ever in Israel's existence. And he's been heavily constrained since day one by high-profile radical right members of his cabinet. They are totally against any kind of a concession and stopping the war, and they are threatening to topple the government if he does that. So that's one constraint that he's facing. And the second one relates to the Israeli public and the Israeli media, and the two are, not necessarily mutually exclusive, but he has to take account of both situations, or both stakeholders, if you like.
Tell me, what is Hamas demanding in terms of a ceasefire, and is it actually realistic that the Israelis would accept it?
I think you hear one voice by Yahya Sinwar, who is one of the masterminds behind the 7th of October attack. He's holed up somewhere in Gaza in one of the tunnels and is thinking about his own survival. The conditions that he is posing is a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, something that Israel under Netanyahu is currently unwilling to agree to.
And world leaders, they are becoming more frustrated by this. That's pretty clear, that the ceasefire negotiations have stalled. The US president says Mr. Netanyahu isn't doing enough to get the hostages back.
Mr. President, do you think it's time for Prime Minister Netanyahu to do more on this issue? Do you think he's doing enough?
No.
And Britain has announced it will suspend some weapons to Israel.
I'll separate that into 2. I mean, Britain's, the amount of weapons that Britain sells Israel is minuscule, I think 1% or something, and they said they will only stop selling part of it. So it's mainly symbolic on the part of the, British government. What is really important and what is crucially important for any kind of change is the American view. And the Americans have been struggling at different levels. Biden is personally committed to the hostages. There are 7 still live American hostages. And whenever they would go further in clashing with Netanyahu, that might lead Hamas to strengthening the resolve not to concede, because one of Hamas' objectives is likely to be creating division between Israel and the Americans. And so if that succeeds, then they have less of an incentive to compromise. So that's another element that the Americans are being concerned about.
So, Eyal, the implications of no ceasefire are huge for the families of the hostages, of course, but also for the death toll in Gaza, which is already really incomprehensible. Health authorities there say it's risen to about 40,000, mostly civilians, and of course many children. There's a lot at stake here.
Yes, I think these calculations are probably underestimations, because I would think that there are a lot of people that are not accounted for. But also the number of people that are wounded is astronomical, and certainly the Israeli public is still struggling to go back to their moral constraints that in ordinary times would have created more impetus to think about what is happening for the Gazan people. They're so absorbed now in their own thing that there's less of a focus in Israel on the suffering in Gaza. The media is not projecting it the way it should, and so that is certainly part of the problem.
All right. So do you think there's any chance that Benjamin Netanyahu could agree to some sort of end to this, to a ceasefire, or is it just at this point not going to happen? There's just no chance of it?
Look, I think that's the million-dollar question. I think nobody can know for sure at this moment. My sense is, and has been for a long time, that the Americans hold the key. They are the only ones that have a leverage over Netanyahu, who's now, again, lost his legacy and so only fighting for his survival. After the elections, my sense is that both sides, whether Trump wins or Kamala Harris wins, I think they will go harder on Netanyahu, much harder than they have. To what extent is Netanyahu either aware or at least believes that this is the case is unclear, because he's putting a lot of confidence in Trump. So whether Trump will be harder on Netanyahu than he is currently is unclear, but my sense is that he will be, because he wants the war out of the way. He's interested in other things. So I think in terms of Israel's or even Netanyahu's benefit, reaching some kind of agreement under the current Biden administration before the elections would benefit Netanyahu more than waiting until after the elections.
And what about Netanyahu's leadership? The Israeli people are increasingly frustrated. We can see that by his leadership. Could that build in some sort of way that actually leads to his removal from the leadership?
I think as soon as the war over Netanyahu is over, but I think the question is now, when will the next election come about? Because there's still a lot of time for that, and whether or not the Israeli public will be able to change the dynamics in parliament and move enough of the people who are currently supporting on the right side of the map are MPs that are supporting the government. So I think a lot will ride on the ability of the Israeli public to change enough MPs' views and positions to early the elections. And I think after the elections, Netanyahu will lose. But whether or not that will happen is, again, everyone's guess.
Yeah, all right. And tell me then, what about the hostages? Because Israel says there's still 101 hostages, they think, in Gaza. What for them now?
That has been the case for a long time. Many of them, we are not sure how many, but dozens of them are already dead, and so they're how many are alive and how many of them will be able to return. Hamas is certainly putting a lot of obstacles from their side on reaching a ceasefire through concessions. And when neither Hamas nor Netanyahu currently are willing to concede more than they have in the past, I guess the fate of both the hostages and millions of people in Gaza is doomed until that changes.
Dr. Eyal Mayroz is a Peace and Conflict Studies Senior Lecturer at Sydney University. This episode was produced by Cara Jensen-McKinnon and Sydney Peed. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. ABC News Daily will be back again tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
I'm Julia Baird.
And I'm not Jeremy Fernandez. In fact, I'm Annabelle Crabb.
On Not Stupid this week,
the fight over what's in and what's out of the census. Well, look at why it matters.
And have you ever ignored medical advice? Elle Macpherson says she ignored advice about a cancer diagnosis. And we have thoughts. You can find it on the ABC Listen app. Just search for Not Stupid.